All right, and the next 2 weeks will be on criminal justice. So we'll be moving into that after obviously tonight's class. The very last class will be your group presentations. I've sent you all a mock grading score sheet basically for the group presentation. So if you have any questions, I'm glad to take them now, or you can send me an email. It's pretty straightforward. It just basically sets out the criteria for the scoring for the presentations. So, and as I said before, I will score, all the presentations according to that grid, and each of you will do that as well, and you'll get participation points for doing that. And the score for the presentations themselves will be a combination of both my scores and the student scores. All right. Okay. So let's move on for the discussion. So I gave you a film this week, or a documentary to watch. It was called "Where Women Go Missing in Canada." So it was it wasn't a sensationalist kind of piece. I didn't want to do that for the purpose of the discussion. This was more of a reflection piece dealing with particularly one family who dealt with a loss of a member of their family. Anybody have any comments they want to share with the class regarding the documentary? Michelle?
I found the documentary, of course, sad as always, and it wasn't as tear-jerking as, because that's what my group is doing, is missing murdered and Indigenous women and children, and it's a very sad. The whole thing is really sad, the Highway of Tears, and I don't understand. People are aware that all these people are going missing, but yet they still continue to hitchhike. And it was really interesting to see another perspective of the lady that was the taxi cab driver, or whatever she was. Her daughter was supposed to go with Jessica, is that her name? The girl that went missing, and they were going to go off to that little town to go visit a friend, and the girl Jessica was murdered, obviously, and her daughter survived. And she was saying, her daughter didn't want to go hitchhiking, and that's the one reason that kept her alive. So I just don't understand if people are aware that this is going on. And to me, I think they got a serial killer out there. And if that that's what they're targeting, that maybe you should just stay home. What's wrong with just staying home?
Well, I totally get that. I mean, there's a number of predators who clearly operate on the Highway of Tears, and it's a very good question. I mean, when it's so obvious that it's a very precarious thing to do, is to hitchhike, particularly alone on a highway, which leads to a lot of women being missing and eventually murdered. It's a very good point. Why would they continue to do that? Elizabeth, your hand was up.
Yeah, I was actually going to comment on that same part of the documentary, but in a different way. I actually think that saying that, if there is a dangerous situation, people should just stop doing it. I think that's victim blaming, and I don't think that that's necessarily the approach that we should be taking with this. I think that it needs to come from a responsibility standpoint, and people need to take accountability for their actions. And I think that, we should live in a society where people should be able to go and do things whenever they feel or see fit, without the threat of being killed. I think that, women should be able to go out in public and drink and not be kidnapped and murdered. I think people should be able to walk at night and not be raped. I think things like this shouldn't happen. And I think that coming at it from a standpoint of women need to arm themselves, or women need to stop hitchhiking, or they need to stop doing things that are seen as precarious. I think that that's coming at it from almost a problematic viewpoint. But I think that yes, they are dangerous situations, but I think that maybe putting more protections in place for women, and I think it was the mayor in the documentary said that we need to that they're dealing with the symptoms but not the cause. And so we need to dig deeper and look at the causes of all of these things that make them more vulnerable, and then find the solution that way.
Good points. Thank you very much. Abigail.
Yeah, so I really agree with Elizabeth. I mean, the documentary shows the main girl they were talking about, she disappeared 25 years ago prior to the documentary being made, and then it's talking about cases that happened very recently. So obviously this is an ongoing issue. And I think if we look at, say this was happening in a different country, Canadians would be all over ending that finding a solution, but it's happening for a quarter of a century and longer here in Canada. And not that there's nothing being done, but there's definitely not enough being done.
And just out of curiosity, what, and this goes back to Elizabeth as well, what do you possibly see as a solution? I mean, whose responsibility would the solution rest with?
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think RCMP and law enforcement need to take a bigger role in this. And I think it was shown, I can't remember the girl's name, but her family took it upon themselves to do the investigating because the police wasn't. I think that the trust between Indigenous people and law enforcement needs to be mended. And I don't know necessarily what the solution would be because I am not Indigenous myself. So I feel like I can't really speak to that, but I definitely feel like there needs to be some reparations with that relationship, and that might make things better.
Yeah, and you're actually, that's exactly what the point is that law enforcement is to a great degree responsible for ensuring safety. And if you've read the material I posted on Moodle, the copy of the inquiry, the Murdered Missing Indigenous Women's and Children and Girls Inquiry, and the material that was appended to that, which was to, in fact, have this issue as a human rights issue. There's a lot of examples where, where the RCMP, and I'm not necessarily saying that they don't try to do their best, like I can't say that, but there are lots of instances where, women have gone missing and the police have just treated it as a matter of fact kind of thing, right? And so, and then obviously that doesn't lead to a good result. Emily.
I just wanted to say that I found it very almost unsettling that every time I can't remember her name, the filmmaker went to the police station, it was always closed, and she could actually only get in touch with one RCMP officer that was on the case who lived in Vancouver. And he barely knew the statistics of the own cases he was working. And it's sad that Indigenous women that go missing or murdered are treated as runaways because their cases aren't looked into until 48 hours afterwards is the time they wait, I think. And they need more action.
Yeah,
I feel like there's not enough being done, and this film was really good at highlighting that.
Yeah, the filmmaker is a Dutch woman. I think her name is Koopman, and I think she was genuinely surprised by the interviews she had with the RCMP. He seemed to be nervous being interviewed on this topic, and that made him appear to be somewhat unsure of what he was doing. And I think because the Koopman, she does these kind of things around the world for all different kinds of issues, that it surprised her that in fact there wasn't more confidence by the RCMP in this issue, particularly the officer who's actually in that district and working with these people. Farhang.
Just one pattern I've noticed between the videos that we watch is that like Justin Trudeau shows up and gives a speech or tries to mediate. Like in this video, he says, "We will fail you no longer, and we will not put this book on the shelf." And then people clap for him. Or in the video on Colton Bush, he meets with the families, takes a few pictures, but at the end of the day, even though the Prime Minister is getting involved, we still don't see any substantial change coming.
Well, and hence the spending of $54 million by the federal government for the Mmiwg inquiry, right? So and to give Trudeau his due, I think he genuinely is trying to do what he can, but he also recognizes that there's a great number of people in this country who don't care about these issues, right? And that's a holdover of colonialism to a great degree. So it's hard. He's a politician. he's done certainly much more than the previous government of Stephen Harper did. Harper was in power for 9 years, from 2006 to 2015, and the Conservative Party almost totally ignored issues around Indigenous rights and safety. So you've got to give Trudeau a lot of credit for going there, and he's still directing his ministers to maintain that position. But politicians can only do so much, right? And so he can't, for instance, direct the RCMP to do their job better. That's not something that a prime minister can do. Or the RCMP are totally independent. But it's a good point. So thanks, Farhang. Rainbow.
Well, a lot of people already sort of touched on what I guess my thoughts were from the documentary, but I thought that it did do a good job of, touching on a lot of the aspects that contribute to like the missing and murdered Indigenous women. So like the issues of like drugs and alcohol, and our textbook also talked about like prostitution and how that kind of contributes, but really, like Liz said, like the main problem is that people find these women and they take them and then they murder them, and it is like, I don't know, I guess like a really hard topic too. And I think the documentary also did a good job of like showing more than just a surface level, but like showing how it affects like the families and the friends, because I also think that's a super important part. And again, like the impacts of the justice and legal systems and the lack of investigations and stuff that happen around it. So that's what my
Right, and we're going to see some more of that in the lecture, and there's a couple of short videos in the lecture we're going to see in a few minutes as well. Michelle, you had your hand back up again?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what I was saying. I agree with what everybody's saying, and I think that women should go out and do whatever we want. I think that we should be equal like men and have those freedoms, but unfortunately we don't. And like you said, the government's putting in out $54 million for murdered, missing, and Indigenous women. I just don't understand. Like, I think a solution, in my opinion, because the police are, they're, how do you say, there's not enough of them, and that's a vast area for 20 police officers kind of thing. Why don't they stick up those deer cameras or those hunting cameras that are, they are motion censored, and they have those solar panel on them, so you don't ever need to change the battery. Like, I don't understand. That would be one way of the next time somebody goes missing or something happens, at least you can track who was going down that highway, and you can get plates and things like that. Like, I just, we have a lot of technology, and I think that a lot of people have said that the government's stalling on this because people, like you said, don't really care. A lot of people don't even know what's going on. A lot of people aren't, a lot of people that live in Toronto don't know that anything exists past Toronto, because that's the major hub, that's the big city, and a lot of people in Canada, in Toronto, where I live, don't speak English. A lot of people speak Cantonese and different languages and aren't aware of what's going on either. So that's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Shel. And just to add to that, I mean, the very specific purpose of the inquiry, and you guys have this in your materials, was to not only to examine and report on what had happened in the past, and to determine what the reasons were and the systemic causes leading to these women being murdered and go missing. But it was also to make recommendations so that this problem could be assessed and addressed. And we're going to talk about that some more tonight in the lecture as well. Ursula, your hand's up.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. Like, I found the film to be okay, but there's things of it I didn't really like the part where she's showing a group of women drinking, like, I don't know. It's just, again, it I don't know, like why did she have to show that? Like, it just shows like, oh, okay, this is why they go are missing and murdered, because they do stuff like this, like it leaves that impression. And I don't think that was a very good thing of her to include into the documentary. I don't know, it could just be me, but other than that, like when you say, yeah, there's a serial killer on the loose, obviously, like, come on, well, what's going on then? What's the RSCMP doing? And then you have people like what Emily say, blaming the victims. Like we shouldn't be doing that. Obviously, if this was happens a different part of Canada, like the police and all that, I hope would be all over it. If there's a serial killer, like it's like what happened in Nova Scotia. A guy like murdered so many people there, and the cops are on it like that. Like I don't know. It's just
Oh, they're good. They're good points, Ursula. Thank you.
yeah.
Emily, your hand's back up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I agreed with Ursula when she said that it's like the video is a little bit oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the word exploitive. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Anyways, but I just wanted to add that sometimes maybe seeing that kind of like raw reality, not that that's a reality for all Indigenous women at all, but like there's a reason why they are in that situation, and it's because of generational trauma. And we need more services that help people with these kinds of addictions. And the video touched upon that, but I feel like they should have maybe explained more if they were going to show that kind of footage.
Yeah, that makes sense. Although you have to keep in mind that the woman who's produced this video, who is Dutch, so she's not Canadian, so she's not particularly, she hasn't lived up in a Canadian society. She doesn't have the awareness that some Canadians do on this issue. So she's bringing a fresh view, and to give her own credit, I mean, she put together what she thought was, a pretty good, documentary on the issues that she thought were important. So we have to give her credit for that, because she only has so much to work with in what I presume is a limited period of time. Does anybody else? I don't see anybody else's hand. Anybody else have anything to say about it? That was a lot of really good discussion. Are we good on this? I'm going to show the video that is I'm going to post on Moodle this week for discussion next week is on Robert Picton, right? And it's going to be a much more graphic video dealing with what happened to a lot of Indigenous women at the hands of probably Canada's most famous serial killer. So we'll talk about that again this time next week. But it will tie in both, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls together with the criminal justice system and how it treats somebody in that particular situation. So that'll be up this week. All right, guys, so let's take it from there. We'll go to the lectures. There's two lectures tonight. One is on murdered, missing Indigenous women and children, and the other one is on the 60s scoop. All right, so let's deal with the first one first. So that's the inquiry itself that was basically initiated a few years ago and was completed 2 years ago. All right, and so I'm talking about it in the present tense because materials I've given you are basically the parameters that the inquiry set out as to what it was supposed to do. All right, so it's a national inquiry. It's a public inquiry, which means it comes together as a function of an operation of what's called the Inquiries Act, which is a federal statute that allows for these kind of things. Provinces have their own inquiries acts for provincial matters. So this one was put in place. It's totally independent of the government. That's what these inquiries are all about. There's been dozens and dozens of inquiries over the last 30 or 40 years put in place by the federal government. So the federal government pays for it. There's usually always a pre-screening process before the inquiry becomes truly operational, which means the parameters of the inquiry are examined. A fair bit of research is also done to see what the criteria should be. There's also the selection of the commissioners for the inquiry, and if you saw the materials I posted, there were 5 commissioners for this inquiry, led by a provincial court judge from British Columbia. Her name is Bullen, so very, very knowledgeable people, all of them with Indigenous ties. So they basically aren't coming at this inquiry from a total position of ignorance, so to speak. Basically, So, this inquiry was a public inquiry established under that particular act. Again, it's independent of the government, right? And so it was established as well through provincial and territorial inquiries as a function of the provincial and territorial cabinets agreeing to participate. So what the total scope of inquiry was very much a national one, where it gives the commissioners the ability to look into the federal, provincial, and territorial jurisdictions that deal with this issue. And obviously, that's really important because we're dealing with not only, for the most part, the Atlantic province, the Prairie provinces, British Columbia to Manitoba, but also the territories themselves. So Northwest Territories, the Yukon, and Nunavut, which have incredibly dense Indigenous populations. All right, so in the background, the reason for the inquiry, and it's pretty obvious to all of you now, basically was, it came about as a function of Indigenous women and girls being disproportionately affected by all forms of violence. And here are the stats relating to the inquiry when it was put into place, so that although Indigenous women make up 4% of the Canadian female population, it's now almost 6%, but at the time this was 4%, 16%, so 4 times that percentage of women murdered in Canada in the last, or between 1980 and 2012, so that 30-year period, were Indigenous, right? So, if you were an Indigenous woman, the prospects of being murdered were 4 times higher than if you had been non-Indigenous, right? That's a pretty significant number. There was a report, an overview prepared by the RCMP, finished in 2014, that identified 1,181 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, right? And that's the number that the commission grabbed a hold of to say, look, this is a tremendous amount of Indigenous women and girls that have been killed or have gone missing. And if they've gone missing for any period of time, the prospect is that they've likely been murdered. Elizabeth, your hand went up.
Yeah, so I was doing research on the statistics for this for a different class, and in my searching, it was said that the numbers are actually thought to be almost double this because of the fact that there is such a distrust between Indigenous communities and the police forces. So they don't report majority of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
Yeah, doesn't surprise me at all. So thank you for that. Okay, we're now going to watch a video. This deals with the women who have gone missing in and around Winnipeg.
Help him pull. Help him pull.
Whoa!
It's free.
What is that?
Whatever it was, we got clothing or something.
Really?
Yeah. Here. Take a picture of it.
So are you thinking you'll put it on Facebook or Instagram or something?
Yeah, it'll be on Facebook, and maybe one of the missing and murdered that are out there, their family member will recognize a piece of clothing. Maybe. Maybe not. It's worth a try, though.
When you feel something like that, you're really curious. You want to know what it is.
I think it's somebody. I think it's somebody, but it's hard to prove, though, right? To just ask me what I think it's somebody.
I'm here in Winnipeg to meet with the volunteer team, Drag the Red. They've been dredging the Red River in Winnipeg for 2 seasons, searching for missing and murdered Indigenous women, and I'm here to see what they find.
1,181 Indigenous women have been murdered or gone missing under suspicious circumstances across Canada since 1980, a homicide rate 4.5 times higher than for non-Aboriginal women. A report by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights noted that murders of Aboriginal women are not investigated with the same urgency as for other Canadians. Despite protests and recommendations, the government has so far refused to launch an inquiry. Aboriginal women make up 4.3% of Canadian women, but represent 16% of all female homicides. Manitoba has the greatest concentration of Aboriginal people in the country at 13.6%. First Nations women account for 49% of female homicides in the province. The body of a 15-year-old First Nations girl named Tina Fontaine was pulled from the Red River in Manitoba's capital, Winnipeg, wrapped in plastic in 2014. Fontaine had been missing for 10 days and was sexually exploited before her death. Police found her body by accident. They were looking for a man who was seen struggling in the river. A group of friends formed Drag the Red to look for more bodies after Fontaine was found.
Hey! Are you Kyle? Yes. Hey, I'm Hillary.
Nice to meet you, Hillary.
It's really nice to meet you too. What are you up to right now?
We're just with an elder. He's had a vision about Bradley Bush's son. He ran into the river a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
So he's just trying. We're just going along the river to see if we could capture his vision. The police won't search this, so it's the perfect way to get rid of anything if the police won't search it.
So you kind of wish that they would give you more help?
I wish they would actually do it themselves. You know, like, there's lots of evidence in there, and that's a fact. And yeah. This is one of my boat drivers.
Okay.
It's Calvin Alexander.
Hey,
It's been nice to the beginning.
Yeah, cool.
I'm Hillary.
Hillary, you're down.
Yeah.
They were trolling the banks,
Yeah, we're just looking for
signs.
Like
his
along
vision.
the sides?
He's the elder that's on
Yeah,
the
along
boat.
the signs.
And Bradley lost his son.
Yeah, so they're looking for his son, and that's
Yeah.
an elder.
So tomorrow, you guys are gonna come out for the drag then?
Yeah, you'll see tomorrow.
For sure.
It's not easy, man.
Drag the Red started as a dozen friends with a borrowed boat. The group's Facebook page now has more than 3,000 members, and 60 regular volunteers search the river every day after work and on weekends. Though they focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women, Drag the Red also helps community members look for family who may have committed suicide by drowning themselves in the river. A forensic anthropologist heard about what they are doing, and she and her team are teaching volunteers how to search the riverbanks more effectively.
We are going to give you a demonstration of how we search and how we search with different kinds of tools. I'm an assistant professor at Brandon University, and I'm also a trained forensic anthropologist.
Hi, I'm Dory Rainey. I'm working on my PhD in physical anthropology. I'm not a forensic or physical anthropologist, I'm an archaeologist. Some of the search that we do is a little bit similar to what these guys do, so I'm here to help today and glad to be here, so thank you.
If it looks like bone, that's when you can take a picture, send it to me, and I can tell you pretty quickly if it's animal or human. If you do come across human remains and they are partially decomposed, now that ground cover that you've been touching is now biohazardous, right?
I saw you yesterday in the boat, and you were out looking for your son, right? Yeah.
We've been searching, dragging on him. I said I was gonna find him, and I'm trying to bring him home. Try to find him. It's really hard. I never be strong to do those things every day.
Bernadette, you started Drag the Red. Can you tell me why you started?
Well, there was a 15-year-old girl pulled out of the river, discarded in a garbage bag like she was garbage, and we were really hoping that the police would have dragged the red, so we had put it on social media. I had put it on social media that, you know, the red needs to be dragged. It was a record last year, like 7 bodies were pulled out of this river, so 4 while we were dragging in 2 months, and the other 3 while we weren't dragging.
Drag the Red has not found any human remains, but think they may be loosening debris and causing bodies to float to the surface later.
There were times where the draggers were dragging and they fully felt like they had snagged on a body but couldn't pull it up, and you know, the next day a body was recovered. So
Why did police say that they're not going to help you search?
well, they say they need evidence to search. Some of the things we've brought in are remains. We didn't know if they were human or not. Many articles of clothing that had blood stains on them. We've pulled stuff up from the river that were held down by cinder blocks. These guys this year pulled out a shotgun. So we make sure we document it and then we hand it over to the police. They have boats. We don't have that many boats. We weren't asking them to come out and die, but we were asking is if they would come out and accompany us dragging. You know, we don't want to put anybody's life at risk. Definitely not. We know that our water is murky, muddy, zero visibility.
I'm at St. John's Park, where everyone's gone to take cover after learning how to search for bones. There's been a tornado warning, so that's why we're taking cover. We're going to go join everyone for the feast.
Do you guys want to have some food? Help yourself. There's some chili there, Maggie, green pop.
Kyle, you started Drag the Red with Bernadette, right? Yeah. Why did you want to do that?
Well, it's like I have a sister missing, and there's lots of missing people out there. And Tina Fontaine was just a teenager, and they pulled her out of there. And I've always wondered if there's any more. It's the easy process of just dragging the bottom. But when you get those big snags, you get a lot of things running through your mind.
Like what?
Like maybe it's somebody. Maybe we're setting them free. Who knows? Maybe this is some answer from my sister.
How long has she been missing now?
It'll be 5 years.
5 years.
It'll be 5 years, yeah. I don't want to turn my back on her, or you know what I mean? I'm not going to stop doing what I'm doing because you just don't do that to family. And if, say, somebody did take her and somebody really did do something bad to her, they got to see her face every time they watch the fucking news. You know what I mean? Sorry for swearing. Sorry for swearing. I'm sorry, yeah, but yeah. Like, they got to see her and every other person, if there is any, say there is somebody, like a serial killer or somebody, that's just somebody, right? They have to live with what they did, and they got to see them every time the news goes on or we have any of these functions. And I hope that it eats them up.
Right, ladies. Okay. You want to grab your bag, Brad?
I'm sorry, Kyle.
That's all good.
Right, Dean.
Gotta get the word out there, right? Everybody gets a life jacket? Oh, they could fit 2 in there.
Ah, thank you so much. So we're gonna head out.
I'll bring back over here. Thank you.
Why do you offer tobacco?
A prayer.
It's a prayer. It's a prayer.
Say a
The
prayer.
great grandmothers, grandfathers, they protect us because it takes a life here all the time, eh?
So what are you guys hoping to do today? What's the plan?
Just drag and just do our best to try to find some evidence. If we can, we can. If we can't, then we'll just come another day.
Is there a particular spot we're heading to?
There's that Alexander Docks. We started off here because of Tina Fontaine, and we've been pulling up stuff ever since. If I wasn't pulling up stuff, then I would move to the next section.
I hear that a lot of people end up in the river from suicide. So do people jump off the bridges?
That's truth. My mom's one of those statistics.
Really?
Yeah. She jumped off the Redwood Bridge.
My sister too. Also, she walked into the water, walked into the river with her own life. And ever since she went in, that's the day I started searching the red.
When was that?
That was last fall, eh?
Yeah, last fall.
Last fall.
That's how I met Daryl. He was looking for his sister. He showed up at opening ceremony and been on board ever since. Okay, so we got to be careful and make sure the rope doesn't wrap around the camera like your foot. It does happen. Just got to be careful, that's all. Because this river is unforgiving and it will, if you give it a chance, it will pull you under. And then I just let it go down. And you'll know when it hits the bottom, when it stops moving, bottom, right? So then you go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you just wait.
So all we're doing is drifting with the current right now, right? Wow.
Still dragging, right? Can you feel it?
Yeah, I can feel it dragging.
We got a snag, guys.
Oh, that's a big one.
That's a big one. We got a bike.
We got a bike, a whole bike. You guys seem to be in really good spirits, but you're doing something so dark. Why is that?
Well, who's gonna do it? How much people do you see out there on this river? There's this boat and that boat.
Do you find it a problem that civilians are doing what could be considered police work?
No, I don't, because we wouldn't be doing it in the first place. If they feel comfort and solace in doing it to bring closure to themselves and anybody else, then all the power to them, and we support that as a police service.
You support it morally, but not with resources.
Correct. It's just not a good allocation of our resources. Basically, it's like looking for a needle in the haystack when you don't even know there's a needle there. Most of those, actually all of those 7 bodies are the ones that have come up and been viewed. None of them were located on the bottom of the river. That's not something that occurs.
But how would you know that there's nothing to find if you're not searching?
We know the likelihood of finding something. It's blackwater diving here, so for a hook to find something is so remote it's not even in the realm of a lottery win.
We dive it as safe as we can, but there is the possibility of being entangled, having your umbilical cut. It's inherently dangerous diving in blackwater. You can't see anything. To risk someone doing that on spec is just not something any of us are willing to do.
Mm-hmm. So is there any point in searching at all?
In our estimation, no.
Maybe that's why people are dumping bodies in there. If 7 bodies have been found in the last year, you don't think it's worth searching at all?
Most of those bodies are suicides that have gone in by themselves. So people aren't readily dumping bodies in the river willy-nilly all the time. So that's kind of a false statement.
You don't think that there have been any murdered women dumped in the river?
Obviously, Tina Fontaine was, but to say anything beyond what's been discovered, I can't say that. Nobody can say that.
In November 2014, less than 3 months after Tina Fontaine's body was found, another First Nations girl, 16-year-old Renelle Harper, was attacked and left for dead on the banks of the Assiniboine River, which meets the Red River in the center of Winnipeg. Construction workers found Harper at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning after she had been attacked twice and thrown into the river the night before. She was taken to the ICU and survived. She is now an advocate for stopping violence against First Nations women.
As a survivor, I respectfully challenge you all to call for a national inquiry into a missing and murdered Indigenous woman.
With her family's permission, police took the unusual step of releasing her name and picture, hoping for tips. Within days, they charged a 20-year-old man and 17-year-old boy with attempted murder, sexual assault with a weapon, and aggravated sexual assault.
I'm excited because I'm out here helping my brother. He calls me pretty much sometimes when he's on the boat and stuff, having like a break or something, telling me what he's found, where he's found it, and he takes a lot of pride in this. That's the scary part for me, is I don't know what I'm gonna pull up and if I can handle it personally, but I think I'm strong enough. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't.
Whoa, what is that?
You feel that? It's like making noise.
Scrape it on something?
Whoa, what's that?
Snake.
Whoa!
So then when you get a big snag like that,
That I
jump on
felt.
board, and we pull it up just to see what it was. We got a plastic
that?
bag and we got panties.
So if you find, women's underwear, you think like maybe there's a woman down there?
I believe there's many people down here.
How many pairs of underwear have you pulled up?
Too many, lots.
Why is there so much underwear in the river?
I don't know. It's just your mind goes crazy, Is there a female down there,
So is the river behind us perhaps the perfect place to hide
a body, for example?
Yeah, I think sadly the river serves a great place to hide a body, and that's a terrible thing to say, but it's true. It's easily accessible in lots of different places along the river, and depending on like the stage of decomposition, bodies will float for a while as the decomposition gases build up, but then as they continue to decompose and they disarticulate, so like their limbs actually separate from the rest of the body, they all sink to the bottom.
You said that you would identify it really quickly, whether it's bone or not, or whether it's of interest or not, if they send you a picture.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So you'll get pictures from them on your cell phone, and you'll just text them back right away.
Yeah.
So you're willing to do that. You're volunteering your time, aren't you?
Yes.
Why are you doing that?
Because it matters. Because people matter. Because the missing matter, and the people that are doing this search, the ones that are committing their time to look for their loved ones or the loved ones of a friend of theirs, they all matter. And even if, despite any training that they have and all the effort that they do, if they don't find anything, that might happen. But the point is that they're trying. And it is, we're happy to help, and Bernadette has my information.
Why do you personally dedicate your time to searching the river and along the banks for the ground search?
Well, I have a sister who's missing since 2008, so it's close to home for me. People came to us in the community and said, you know, I had reported this to the police, they didn't look into it, it's not being investigated. So we had to get, political will behind us to say, like, we need some help here. Could you, come and make sure that the police are doing what they need to be doing in terms of investigation? Because it took them 10 days before they started investigating my sister's case.
Do you think there's a difference between how police treat, for example, white residents and Indigenous residents for when someone goes missing?
Definitely. There was one case last summer where they actually went door to door, knocking on doors. Like, when my sister went missing, that wasn't the same response. Women are treated less than, and if you're Indigenous, that's even more so, because, we're considered disposable, like no one's gonna miss us or care about us, when in reality, we all have families that care about us.
Drag the Red has told us that as Indigenous people, they feel that police aren't caring about them. What are you planning to do to address that issue?
We do care about them. I meet with Bernadette all the time, Bernadette Smith. We've had several discussions. We support their initiative in the sense that if they feel they're doing something constructive to address what they see as an issue, then we support that. To allocate resources to that when we, as the experts that know the river, know that it's remotely unlikely to find something like that.
If they were to find something, a bone that was human, would you then commit resources?
Absolutely. That's
what
we
would
do.
you do next?
We would find out where that bone came from. As a matter of fact, they turned in several bones last year that turned out not to be of human origin.
But the question is, could you do more?
And that's what I'm saying. I really don't think there is anything we can do more other than drain this river and walk it end to end and have a look. Like I said, doesn't matter how much money we have. There's really no other way to check it.
So why don't police want you doing this? Have you asked them for help?
Yeah.
And what do they say?
We won't do it. It's risk over reward.
What does that mean?
I don't know. I really don't know. Like, you're doing it right now, they're risking their lives, and who knows, and maybe there's not even a reward there, maybe. But if they knew there was somebody there, maybe then they would do it. Because then it's more of a, so I don't know.
Because they need evidence to be able to go after it, right?
Well, yeah, they need evidence, but to me, it's just common sense, Everybody would, in my eyes, you want to get rid of something, you throw it in here. Best way to get rid of something.
2 days after we left Winnipeg, a man's body was found in the Red River. 2 weeks after that, another man's body floated in and out of sight for 8 days before it was pulled out. Police do not suspect foul play in either case. There are still 52 unsolved murders and disappearances of Aboriginal women and girls in Manitoba, and nearly 1,200 in Canada. A couple of days ago, you smelled something?
Kind of smells fishy.
Yesterday at St. John's Park. I don't know if you guys noticed that smell, but we all did.
Same with the anthropologist.
That's why we were there. We were walking around there. Always picking up the scent.
And to you, that smelled like a
I
body?
smelled the body coming across there somewhere.
Life jackets down, bro.
And there's any chance that might not have been a body?
100% sure that's a body.
All right, guys, that's a tough video to watch, but it's something I think it's important that you know the lengths to which people will go to try to provide information and closure to a great degree for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So now we're going to talk about in the rest of this particular lecture about the actual logistics revolving around the inquiry. Right, there's been lots, there's been other reports and studies that looked into the violence towards women and identified the underlying causes, and everybody pretty much agrees what they are. Clearly, and we touched upon this when we talked about the video this week. We talked about causes like poverty, and homelessness, and how that that those things were relied upon, including things like prostitution and alcohol abuse and what have you, that make sometimes, and in very many cases often, make a lot of the women vulnerable to being taken. It's seen as systemic causes relating to racism, sexism, colonialism, and even the continuing devastation caused by residential school systems, which obviously will continue still for a while. There have been over 1,700 recommendations made to date. This is before the public inquiry that we're now talking about. So the purpose of this inquiry, and this is what the government said at the front of the inquiry within its preamble, was that it was a step towards reconciliation to a great degree in a nation-to-nation relationship, right? And so, and to go back to what Farhang was saying before about the level of engagement of the federal government, this particular federal government often refers back to it being a nation-to-nation relationship in which it tries to provide context for what this government is doing for Indigenous peoples in the country, right? And that's really, really important because, as we've seen over the course of the semester, where, first contact with the British and the French was on a nation-to-nation relationship, because clearly the millions of Indigenous peoples that they found here on Turtle Island, was the dominant society, right? That, you could do, the very least the British, the French could do was hope for a nation-to-nation relationship because they were the minority parties. But as we also have seen over the course of time with the, incredible expansion of colonialism and immigration to North America, that the nation-to-nation relationship disappeared to a great degree because it benefited the colonizers for the purposes of acquiring land to basically treat the acquisition of those lands on the premise of a dominant race, rather than having to negotiate with people that were of any kind of an equal status. So we've seen how that has happened. The mandate, again, of the inquiry was to examine and report on the systemic causes behind the violence that women experience. And in addition to the experience, to look into the vulnerability to that violence taking place and the patterns and underlying factors that explain why higher levels of violence in fact occur. And it's pretty much statistically proven that they do occur on a regular basis. So again, they're mandated to look at the underlying historical, social, economic, institutional, and cultural factors that contribute to the violence. This leads to an examination of practices and policies relating to policing, child welfare, the reports of coroners where in fact they have found bodies and therefore were examined basically, and to see how they relate to those practices and policies with respect to governmental practices and policies and socio-economic conditions, which just kind of makes sense, right? As part of their mandate, the commissioners will examine the institutional policies and practices in place, put in place to respond to that violence. Again, that's a function of those 1,700 odd recommendations that were out there prior to the this particular inquiry coming into being, basically, and to look at what policies have been put in place to see how effective they've been in reducing violence and therefore increasing the prospect of safety for Indigenous women and girls. So the recommendations, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, the recommendations included the commissioners, basically dedicated to doing the following: to recommend concrete actions to remove the systemic causes of violence, and that really relates to all those subcategories we just talked about, and to increase safety, basically, to recommend ways to honor and commemorate those missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls whose names they have. All right. And here's what we're going to see now. This is a Power and Politics piece on the final report that the inquiry finally provided, and the calls for justice as a function of the inquiry itself.
It took 2 years of cross-country hearings and painful testimony from more than 1,400 family members and survivors. The inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls has now issued its final report, and the commissioners reached what they called an inescapable conclusion that what happened to these women and girls over several decades amounts to Canadian genocide. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he will thoroughly review the report's 231 recommendations and develop a national plan in response. But what needs to happen right away? Marion Buller is the Chief Commissioner of the National Inquiry. She joins me now. Hi, Chief Commissioner Buller.
Hello.
Nice to see you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
I know it's been a long day. Let me start off by asking you, I know there's a lot to get into when it comes to the recommendations, but what, specifically around the conclusion that Canadian genocide occurred, can you explain why that conclusion was reached?
Well, first of all, I have to explain that genocide can come in many forms, and we, myself included, think of genocide as the Holocaust or the Tutsi people who were murdered, other mass murders that have occurred. That's only one type of genocide. There are other types of genocide. And we heard from families and survivors all across Canada about generations of violence, generations of human and Indigenous rights violations and abuses, generations of children who have been forcibly removed from their families, things like that. The only conclusion could be genocide.
There's no qualifier, though, to it. I mean, in the past, when it's been used with respect to the treatment of Indigenous people in this country, there has been a qualifier like cultural attached to it. Was it significant that qualifier was not attached in this case?
I think it was very significant and a conscious move on our part to not have a qualifier in front of it. Genocide is genocide as far as we're concerned. And I won't go into the very long legal definition, but genocide is genocide.
Where legalities are concerned, how important is it, from your perspective, that the federal government adopt that finding, that they arrive at the same conclusion?
It's very important that the federal government comes to the same conclusion. Provincial and territorial governments as well, because we're a national inquiry. And that's because by adopting or accepting that conclusion, it means that they're going to allocate the resources, take the urgent measures that are required, give the proper scope of responses to our calls for justice.
The Prime Minister did not use the word. He did come in, he did listen to the closing ceremony today. He did deliver a speech. He did not use the word in his speech. What's your reaction to that?
There's one side of me who says, well, we should give him the opportunity to read the 1,200 pages. But on the other hand, it's concerning to me because that's an indication that the government may not respond on an urgent enough and large enough scale.
Let's talk about what you hope for when it comes to the government's response. There are 231 calls for justice or recommendations in this. There are only 3 weeks left of this session. What is an appropriate amount of time, do you think, for the government to read through this and come up with, I think they called it an action plan?
I don't think that a proper action plan can be developed in 3 weeks by any party. It's going to take time. It's going to require building relationships with Indigenous communities and people. It's going to take time to plan properly. So it's going to be the next government, whoever that is.
Are you worried, or I don't know which way to look at it. Is it a good thing? Is it a concerning thing that it might become an election issue?
Oh, I think it'd be fabulous if it was an election issue, and it should be an election issue. What has been happening to Indigenous women and girls for generations is, as we've said so many times, a national tragedy, and it should be at the top of the list when it comes to party platforms.
You also called, and I can't remember, I have read that when you were talking about the calls for justice, you called them legal imperatives. What does that mean?
That means that these aren't recommendations or suggestions or options for the government. They're more than that. In so many locations where we heard from families and survivors, we heard of generations of Indigenous and human rights abuses. Well, Canada has signed on to several international UN documents, treaties, instruments to say that they will uphold Indigenous and human rights. So it's beginning to look like Canada is in conflict with what they've signed and what they're actually doing.
Are there consequences to that, though?
From our perspective, National Inquiry, no. If there are consequences in a legal sense, that would be for somebody else to decide.
So from where you sit at this point, from your perspective, they're legal imperatives, but there aren't consequences.
Oh, well,
I guess it's
the voters will. Voters will provide those consequences, but not criminal liability in the sense of a war crimes tribunal.
Do you expect all of the recommendations to be adopted?
Absolutely.
Do you think that is, I mean, when you look at feasibility when it comes to that, I mean, I think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and when this government was in opposition, they said they'd adopt every recommendation. There were 94. 28 of them have not even been touched yet. Is there any sort of level of concern around them saying we're going to adopt everything, or any government, whatever it ends up being, saying that and falling short on actually implementing them?
Well, I think that's a concern everyone has. And in the course of our hearings, we have been able to meet and make new non-Indigenous allies. Families and survivors who came forward and some who didn't now are strong advocates for our report and our calls for justice. Those frontline people, those activists who for 40 years worked to make this national inquiry happen, those allies, those activists, those families and survivors are not going to let go of this.
What differentiates this from, and I know obviously in scope, it's much bigger, but I remember when there were calls under the previous government for this inquiry to happen. And I remember, I think it was Peter MacKay, who was the Justice Minister at the time, referred to, I think he said there were 40 studies that had been done in the past, that, you know, focus should be on action, not on studying further. What new is there in this?
There's a lot of new in this because over 2,000 families and survivors came forward and told their truths that hadn't been told in public before or hadn't been recorded in some other way. I know it sounds kind of like a bad expression, but the people have spoken, and they didn't speak before in these ways in those earlier reports.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Chief Commissioner Buller. Appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you.
This process has tested me to my core. As a non-Indigenous person, I have struggled to come to terms with my role in Canada's genocide. I have sat with feelings that I'm sure many of you non-Indigenous people in the room or watching may be feeling and sitting with right now. Shame, guilt, denial, that urge to say no, no, no. That's not what this is. This is not who I am. I didn't play a part in this. My ancestors didn't play a part in this. We're good people, no. But it's the truth. It's our truth. It's my truth. It's your truth.
That was one of the 4 commissioners speaking earlier today before delivering their final report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this country. The report says the deaths and disappearances amount to a, quote, Canadian genocide, and it has made 231 recommendations or calls for justice to government and police to help address the problem. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is vowing action, but he stopped short of calling it a genocide. Will that change? And what will the government prioritize when it does take action? Carolyn Bennett is the Minister of Crown, Indigenous Relations. She joins me now in studio. Hi, Minister. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming in. Will the government be calling what happened to Indigenous women and girls in this country a genocide?
We have accepted what the Commissioner's recommendations or calls for justice are. This is a very important part of the report to the families. This is what they heard, and yes, we will support the Commission's findings.
So the government will term this a genocide?
Well, I think it's from the colonial policies that have been ongoing. From the Indian Act to residential schools to 60 Scoop to these were government policies that resulted in this vulnerability of Indigenous women and girls. It is throughout the pre-inquiry we were clear that racism and sexism kills, and so this was about the families and the survivors. This was to be the center of the report, and now the Prime Minister has been very clear. This report won't sit on a shelf. That we need a national action plan with all of the partners, the provinces and territories, municipalities, Indigenous governments, to go forward in a distinctions-based way, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, bottom up with regional sensitivities, and because right from the beginning, our job was to do what those people who came to the Hill 14 years ago asking us to do. It needed to be justice for the families, support and healing for the families, and also to put in place concrete measures to make sure this wouldn't happen again. The prevention, so that other families wouldn't have to put up with.
And I'll ask you about that in a second. I take your point, but I don't hear you using the word genocide, and the Prime Minister today, in his remarks, also did not use that word. Why not?
I think the Prime Minister felt very strongly that the media reports and the leaks were there, but that we needed to formally receive the report as we respond, and that we promised we would respond with our partners as we go forward. It was very, very clear.
He didn't want to say the term unless he had read it himself in the report, because it's not just through the leaks. I mean, it's the actual report that goes over. There's going to be a supplementary report as well, just simply focused on genocide and why the commissioners decided it should be called that.
Yeah.
So you're saying he's waiting for that?
Well, I think that it is a matter of us working with our partners, but we are accepting what the commissioners found, yes.
So it was a genocide?
That's what the commissioners found.
Okay, Minister, let me ask you about the recommendations. 231 calls for justice. Will your government accept all of them?
So that's why the National Action Plan becomes so important. Obviously, we had always said that we wouldn't wait for the final report and that we would get on with the things that families and survivors had told us we needed to get on with. And so from the social conditions to shelters to changes in child and family services, the healing supports, all of those things, we've been moving on those things, but we know that today we have got to get together with our First Nations, Inuit, Métis partners to really make sure there's an action plan of what, by when, and how.
What is the timeline on that plan? And I ask because you're up against a clock right now. The House is only sitting for another 3 weeks. It will rise and we head into an election. Is there any realistic possibility that a concrete action plan based on these recommendations, not just what you've done in the past, based on these new recommendations, will actually happen?
Well, I think that we need to get to work right away with our partners to actually even determine the process to develop that plan as what are the priorities, the what, by when, and how. How do we work with our partners to make sure they feel that they've been heard and that everybody, that the provinces and territories, municipalities, Indigenous governments see themselves as part of it. The other plan, I think, that was very clear in the report was how do we get all Canadians on side to see their role in calling out racism and sexism? How do we make sure all Canadians feel that they are part of ending this tragedy?
There is, though, a focus on what the government can do as well, obviously, right? A lot of the recommendations. And I want to make sure we have a sense of how this government would or promise to act on whatever you adopt. And I'm asking because, for example, with the TRC recommendations, 94 recommendations when your government was in opposition, you accepted all of them. 28 of them haven't even been touched yet. So when you're talking about 231 recommendations, what is a realistic sense, and some of them which are very, basically overhauling the justice system. You know, what kind of action can people who are affected by this expect to see?
Well, I think, I mean, on the TRC calls to action, we're at 80% done or well on their way, and so we are.
We have 28 of 94 that haven't even been started.
Well, I think of the federal ones, but okay, well, let's just say we're going to start by starting, and so starting by starting means that firstly we have to make sure that this isn't done unilaterally, top down. They've been very clear. It has to be nothing about us without us, and in developing that national action plan, that will take whatever time it takes to get it right and make sure our partners are working with us on this. So, but there are some things that I think they've asked for that we will want to do and look at, and obviously.
Can you do that before the House rises? Like, is there basically, will anything change between today and when the House rises?
I think so, and I think that the kind of work that Minister Monsef has been doing on commemoration, the kinds of things that were even in the response to the interim report. Again, the dollars for healing, the special unit within the RCMP on best practices, the other initiatives with law enforcement.
But will there be any sort of response to today's report, I guess, between now and the end of the month?
Well, as soon as we get through, as you've said, it's substantial. Perfect. And that we will, this is the art of the possible, and we're going to do everything we can. We will not let these families down. This is too important, and that we want to do everything possible.
Okay, I have to leave it there. Thank you, Minister Bennett.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Opposition parties also reacted to today's final report from the inquiry. Have a listen.
What is going on to the Indigenous community, particularly in light of the report to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, is a complete system failure. A failure on the system of policing, access to resources, socioeconomically. This systemic failure is a genocide, and I support the final reports calling it a genocide.
I think the focus on one word today takes away from the importance of what we have. And what we had, who was sitting right next to me throughout, she was holding a picture of her 15-year-old daughter. What she wants to know is that the government has a plan that it's not going to happen again.
Today is an emotional day for me. You know, it's the end of the national inquiry. So many of us family members fought for this national inquiry. Some of it was good, some of it was bad. Some families couldn't even testify, it was just too hard. Canada is a first world country. This shouldn't be happening here. We need to lead by example. This has got to stop.
It took 2 years of cross-country hearings and painful testimony from more than 1,400 family members and survivors. The inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, though, has now issued its final report, and the commissioners reached what they called an inescapable conclusion that what happened to these women and girls over several decades amounts to Canadian genocide. The report finds Indigenous women are 12 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than other women. It also finds they are attacked physically or sexually almost 3 times as often as non-Indigenous women. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he will thoroughly review the report's 231 recommendations and then develop a national plan in response. But how have families viewed this entire process? Maria Jacko is the aunt of Mmiwg, who went missing in 2008. She joins me now. Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Start off, if you can, just by telling me about your niece.
My niece, Maisie, she's vibrant. She was 16 when she went missing, and she was full of life, and she was happy-go-lucky, and she loved my kids, and she was just everything. She was full of life, and she was everything to our family.
And what happened?
She went missing with her friend September 6, 2008, and she went missing without a trace. So no follow, no leads, no nothing. It's over 10 years later, and still missing, still no clues, still no answers.
What has the process been like since then? Like your involvement with, let's say, police or those who should be investigating this type of thing. What has it been like for your family?
It's been difficult, you know, because nobody went missing in our community, and so this was a first. So it wasn't properly, like the girls, there was no Amber Alert. The girls were both 16 years old. There's no Amber Alert given, you know, and just families doing a lot of work. Families doing everything. Like I didn't know what to do at the time. I lived in Ottawa and I wanted to be back home and I wanted to help and do something in some way. And I ended up creating a website because I just learned how to make websites. And I still have it going. It's findmaisyandshannon.com. And it's a website where you can donate for a reward, or you can send in emails, or you can find out like, you know, what's going on.
What does it say to you that you and your family had to set that up?
That speaks volumes, you know, because I set up the first official search, which, you know, Maisie and Shannon went missing September 6, 2008, and I've contacted our CMP. They told me about Search and Rescue Global 1. They told me about Missing Children Society of Canada, and through all this knowledge, then I set up the first search with Search and Rescue Global 1, and that happened December of 2008, 2 months after the girls went missing.
Do you feel like the support that you should have had was not there from, for example, agencies like the RCMP?
Yes, I've talked with the RCMP on the phone, and that's for hours and hours and hours, because I wanted to know what can I do? I feel helpless here, you know, and you know, I know that they had to be invited into our community, and they had to work with the police, but it's difficult because, you know, there was nothing in place for what goes on. But now I know, you know, and now I feel like it could help other families because I know the process, you know.
Do you feel like there is more awareness? This is 10 years ago you're talking about. Do you feel like, I mean, we're obviously here today because the inquiry has released its final report, but do you feel like things, if this were to happen now, it would be different?
Yes and no, because it would be different in that, you know, that now we have Mmiwg. We didn't even have that when Maisie and Shannon went missing. We didn't even have that term when they went missing, you know. Right. And so we have that, and and this inquiry was a place that, you know, families can tell their stories, you know, and families can relate to one another, and we have that now. But still, we don't have anything in place that, what happens if somebody goes missing in our community again?
Do you feel like anything would be different today if someone went missing in that community?
Well, somebody did go missing in our community, and again, and right away I called and I was like, let's contact Search and Rescue Global 1. Let's do this. Let's do that.
You
know
knew what to do.
Yes, and fortunately the girl was found right away, and it happened again. You know what I mean? So we knew, and then we were able to take these little steps. You know, but
do you still feel like the onus is on the community? Like, do you feel like you're still the one who has to do that stuff? Or is there more help?
There's our community. We have a great community, Kitaganzibi. Like you know, a lot of people have come and they've done searches in our community, and I feel our community is great, you know. But yes, you know, to have something implemented that is, you know, that is something that we can follow and structured, you know.
That's a lot amazing. That's a lot of what today is about, right? Like it's a call to action. There's 231 recommendations for the government. You know, lots of people from the government are watching right now. If you had a message for them today, what is it?
Well, I think that these 231 calls for action, it's a great step, you know, because it's something, you know. The last government didn't even do an inquiry. We have this inquiry now, you know. This is a step in making real change, is implementing those 231 calls to action, you know, because the TRC had 94 calls to action, and even before the RCAP, they had 440 calls to action in 1996. And just now, some of those RCAP calls to actions are just coming to fruition, and it's 25 years later. I don't want these 231 calls to action to happen 25 years later. You know, I want it to happen now.
Do you have faith that will be the case? Like, do you think enough has changed in 25 years? Do you think society wants government? Like, do you know what I mean? Do you have that feeling that this could be different, or are you skeptical that because in the past they've fallen short, the government could again, or any government?
I am, but at the same time, this is the first government that they said they were going to do an inquiry. An inquiry was done. You know, this, you know, and now this report, we have this 1,200-page report, and with these 231 calls to action, and I think this should be a blueprint for any government, you know, to go ahead, you know, and that's what we do.
All right, thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming in today. Thank you. That's Maria Jacko. She's the aunt of Mmiwg, who went missing back in 2008. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics.
All right, guys, so before we move off this, and this is the last slide for this particular topic, I just want to say to you that the timing really has been poor to put those 231 calls to action back into place, because this video comes from, it was early fall 2019. There was a federal election that had to take place, and it did take place the third week of October of 2019. And so as a function of that election, I mean, nothing happens, right, between the time this report was released and the election. I mean, the Parliament shuts down. Everybody's out there, trying to get votes and trying to win the election and what have you. And as you guys would all know, the Liberal Party did in fact win again, but it went from a majority position to a minority position in October of 2019. And then after an election, there's always, 1 or 2 months before Parliament is reconvened to get things back in order. The Prime Minister has to send out his mandate letters to all his ministers and what have you. So the 45th Parliament, which is the one we currently have, came back into power, and started sitting in around just before Christmas of 2019. And then, of course, with Christmas, it closes down again. Everybody goes back to their ridings and goes back to their families. And then you guys all know what happened in 2020, right? I mean, though they didn't reconvene early in 2020, we knew by February that we were going to have a problem. And the problem was turning into COVID-19. And so from the middle of February going forward, the federal government's almost total focus was on responding to the pandemic, right? With, whatever programs it could put in place to try to keep, businesses and people afloat to a great degree. And it hasn't done virtually anything else since then. And we're still in that mode of the pandemic. And the government is still looking at what can it do, now with the vaccination rollout to get this pandemic and put it behind us. So, the group, there's one of the groups for the group presentations in the class, in our last class in a few weeks is going to be talking about this particular inquiry. So, whether they give us more detail on the calls to action or the calls to justice, the 231 calls, we'll see whether they do anything about that. But there really hasn't been an opportunity for this current government to deal with, its promise to put into place those calls to action, right? So, we're pretty much been in limbo politically from the time that this interview you just watched took place. All right, guys, so that's it for this particular topic. So we're now going to shift, and I'm going to share with you the other topic for tonight, which is the 60 Scoop. All right, and the 60 Scoop we touched upon, and it's in your readings previously about 2-3 weeks ago. We talked about family violence and what have you. This was part of it, and also part of at the end of the residential school material, because to a great degree, the 60 Scoop was an extension of Canadian policy relating to the placement of Indigenous children in non-Indigenous environments or homes. Okay, and so let me just see here. For some reason or other, that was the other one. The other one popped up. So let me do this again. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, guys. So now again, the 60 Scoop, right? It's a generic term. It's it's just one of those catchy things that people refer to, because when you use that term, everybody pretty much knows what we're talking about who has any knowledge of these events. So what happened is that in the 1950s and early 60s, we know that residential schools were, it had become a national phenomenon in that the Canadian citizenry as a whole had pretty much been made aware of what had gone on, the relationship between the federal government and, the churches, the Roman Catholic, Anglican, United, and Presbyterian, those churches. They know what had gone on. They had a pretty good idea of the harm that was being caused by these schools. And so, there was an active campaign to close them down, the residential schools. And as you guys also know, the last school didn't close until 1996. So it took 40 years, after, everybody kind of became aware of this issue for it to actually be resolved by closing down the last school. But having said that, we're still dealing with a predominantly white British society. So, Canada in the 1950s and 60s was still highly, it wasn't a British colony, obviously, anymore, but it was a British dominion, right? And so it still had, the majority of the white population were of a British stock, right? So they're of British ancestry, and with the colonial past. So, even though, the citizenry on the whole understood the harms caused by residential schools, they still believed, to a great degree, that taking Indigenous children out of their environment, within their own, in First Nations, within their own bands, or if they weren't on First Nation reserves, whatever territory they lived in, the white society still believed to a great degree that these children would do better in homes or environments that were not Indigenous, right? That was still the mindset. And so what happened is that because they weren't being placed into residential schools, what was happening is that these children were being taken and being collected by child welfare agencies, right? Who would take the child out of their home for very minimal reasons, right? Matter of fact, if the home language was not English, then child welfare agencies saw that as a reason to take a child out of the home, because that child had no opportunity to grow and prosper in Canada if that child did not grow up learning English. So the reasons for taking children out of the homes were incredibly spurious, and so thousands and thousands of Indigenous children who over the course of the previous 120 years were being put in residential schools, where in fact obviously they were taught to read and write and only operate in English. They were now being taken again out of Indigenous homes and basically putting into child welfare agencies, who then took on the job of putting them in non-Indigenous environments, right? So essentially the 60s scoop, right? Again, it started in the late 50s, but was full force in the 1960s, basically picked up where residential schools left off, and it continued through the 1970s and well into the 1980s, right? So it was a practice that took hold for 25 to 30 odd years. One program, as I say here, was Adopt Indian and Métis Children, the AIM program, and that's how it was advertised. And so what you would do is you would see ads being placed in newspapers, a lot of them now outside of Canada, so that they weren't tainted by the residential school. Wasn't a scandal at that point, but certainly the workings of that system. So a lot of child welfare agencies and provincial governments and social services, they would basically advertise in newspapers, because there was no internet or web, so people read actual physical newspapers back then. So they advertised in newspapers around the world pretty much, but to a great degree in the United States and Europe, again fundamentally white societies, right? That they would have these very, very nice pictures of young Indigenous children whose hair was cut short, who were wearing white men's clothing, non-Indigenous clothing, and basically saying adopt these children. Look how beautiful these children are. Adopt them, give them a home, give them a white man's home, so that they can prosper and succeed. So again, that's what this is saying, that the photos were put in to families in America and Europe. As part of this process, Indigenous single women were pressured to give up their children, right? So obviously they weren't married, so it was a situation where it was going to be a single mother, where there's a great deal of pressure, basically saying, look, you cannot raise this child as well as a God-fearing, upstanding white family can, right? And that's the kind of pressure that doctors and nurses put on women. And they were told, and they were lied to about this, they were told that these children would be placed only on a temporary basis until the young mother, who gave up her child, had the ability to get herself back on her feet. So, basically recovered from the birth, and reestablished herself, whether it's on her First Nation or wherever it's, or in an urban setting, it really didn't matter. But, the whole idea was these child welfare agencies were saying, look, we're going to place your child in a home on a temporary basis while you reestablish yourself, and then the child will come back to you and you can have a happy family forever going forward. That was a lie, right? What they did with these children is they adopted them out to white families, in the US and Europe. And when they adopted them and they sealed those records, so the mothers had no access to those adoption records for decades, until for almost always the children, they never could access those records until 20, 30 years ago, when these children, were now adults and had a total entire life without their mother or their parents. So having said that, that was how this program was run. And so, again, when the women went to get their children, they found out that they had in fact been adopted and were beyond their reach. And just imagine how painful that obviously was. And the program administrators believed that if the children were removed from their homes early enough, they wouldn't be, and this is the term they actually used, they wouldn't be imprinted as Indigenous, right? That's exactly the same thing that residential schools were aimed at doing. Take the Indian out of the child, right? That's exactly what they were doing. Okay. So, and again, families were deemed to be insufficient, by middle white class standards, and they were taken away, right? And it was promoted and endorsed by provinces and social services in those provinces, basically. And again, I was saying, they didn't speak English, perhaps, or a worker would go into a home and look into, their fridge, if they had a fridge, or wherever they stored their food. And, if it was, an Indigenous traditional diet of dried meat and berries, then these people were accused, these parents, these loving parents, were accused of not providing their children with proper nutrition because there was perhaps a lack of a fridge, those kind of things. Siblings were often separated, right? Brought up in entirely white environments apart from each other. There are a number of examples, I didn't post them in the lecture, but there were a number of examples where, for instance, brothers and sisters would eventually find each other, but not until they were in their 50s and 60s, right? And what an emotional thing that would be, to find that, you have a sibling, that you were separated from when you were too small to know them, and you missed an entire lifetime of having that kind of bond with a brother or sister, right? So tens of thousands of children were taken from their families. This is every bit as devastating as residential schools, when it comes to the emotional damage it would have done to not only the children, but the families they were ripped out of, basically. And 3 provinces, Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, have now issued formal apologies and provided compensation for the victims of the 60s scoop, right? And then the last thing for tonight we're going to do is we're going to watch this documentary about this exact phenomenon.
This is a special adoption program. The provincial government feels that this program is essential. For the past 5 years, the number of children in care of the Department of Welfare has been increasing by approximately 180 a year. This trend is causing us real concern. While we have had reasonable success in placing white children for adoption, we have had great difficulty in placing Indian and Métis children.
paternalism, racism, the belief that their culture and value system is superior to ours. But you see, as you get older, that longing to know where you're from, who your brothers and sisters are, and to reconnect with that side of your family, because that's what's missing. Something is missing from you.
I really began to take on, you know, these unwritten rules in terms of survival. Don't talk, don't feel, whatever you do, don't trust, and don't open up, because that just meant the threat of moving on to another home.
Canadians, for the most part, people in Saskatchewan had little understanding of First Nations and Métis history aside from a very white supremacist approach. Little was known about the treaties. Little was known about the Indian Act. And so what people had to go on was what advertisement told them.
I couldn't even cry because I was so angry, I was so frustrated, and I could feel me saying to myself, I don't care if they kill me, they will have to kill me to keep my children.
After all, Indian and Métis children have the same potential as white. The only difference is the color of their skin.
My name is Robert Doucette. I am originally a Mackay from northwest Saskatchewan. I was born February 28, 1962. I am of Cree, Métis, Dene ancestry. I was taken away when I was 4 months old. I think one of the reasons why was because firstly, my mother was Aboriginal. She's Métis. And the Canadian and the provincial governments have a long-standing, they've got a long-standing goal to assimilate Aboriginal people. I think that racist notion that they could raise our kids better than us predominated. You know, growing up, you're always called chief and Nietzsche and, you know, breed, all of these, and you wonder, well, why am I being called this? And you come to understand that you're not really part of that family. You're from somewhere else, and then you start creating mechanisms to cope with all of this stuff to survive.
There was a century of racial bias on the part of many non-Indigenous families in Saskatchewan and Canada. It's no secret that First Nations and Métis people were perceived as less than white. White supremacy was very common in Canada. My name is Allison Stevenson. I am a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples and Global Social Justice at the University of Regina. I'm in the Department of Politics and International Studies. As a Métis adoptee, I have a personal experience with adoption. Although I wasn't scooped, I was voluntarily relinquished by my birth mother. And so the injustice around colonization and the continued oppression of Indigenous families is something that continues to motivate me. It appears as though families knew very little about what was happening to their children in some cases. There were evidence of scoopings where children were just simply taken and lost into the so-called system. The official, as in the government, justifications for the adoption, the increasing emphasis on adoption, was the high numbers of children that were coming into care that were so-called languishing in foster care. So adoption was seen as a better answer to a lifetime of living in foster care.
only picture I have of myself was a photo taking down in Regina at their head office of the Department of Social Services. And they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And you can see already at age 3.5, I was through 9 foster homes. And after 9 foster homes, really, what does a child have to smile about? My name is Jackie Marie Maurice from Meadow Lake and Green Lake area in Saskatchewan here. And I do identify as Métis. Yet, once you begin to hear my story, it wasn't always that way, and that wasn't always common knowledge for me. I was scooped right from birth from Meadow Lake Union Hospital and made a permanent ward of the government. And in my particular case, I wasn't made registered for adoption, so that meant I went through numerous foster homes. There were lots of physical traumas, sexual traumas. There was a lot of spiritual abuse in that foster home, and I stayed there for about 7 years. But that feels like a lifetime for a child. And then even then I began to even close down, you know, by the age of 9 and 10. Really, age 9 was the first attempt on my young life. And I always say, you know, I was probably age 9, almost 10 years old, but I felt like 110 because of my experiences, and I really felt not heard.
Have you ever considered adopting a child? Many couples have found their happiness through AIM.
So the AIM program, AIM is an acronym for the Adopt Indian and Métis program. It started as a pilot in Saskatchewan in 1967, and it was funded by the federal government initially. And so the goal was to really demonstrate that First Nations and Métis children were adoptable, that they could become potential family members for non-Indigenous families.
AIM is a division of the Department of Welfare, established as a placement service for Indian and Métis children. AIM, 2340 Albert in Regina. All inquiries handled promptly and in confidence.
So it was really almost an experiment, so to speak, and it was found to be quite successful. The rates of children adopted, while they weren't enormous, they demonstrated an upward tick. So this said to the government that advertising of Indigenous children with particular types of images successfully stimulates transracial adoption.
In my family, they've tried to help me understand what happened and how they felt. And one of the things that happened about 4 years ago, I was at my mother's place in Lac La Biche, and she said to me, you know, I've got something for you. So she says, I've kept it all these years. So she went to the closet and she came out and she brought this, and she said, this is the sweater they took off you when they scooped you, the day they scooped you. And I've kept it now for 53 years. And on your birthday, I would bring it out and I would hold it and smell it to remind myself that I had a son out there and that I loved him and we wanted him back. And she gave this to me. This is the sweater that my mother kept for 53 years to remind herself that she had a 60-scoop son. Now, if anything I've learned from that is that my mother did want me back.
The more and more I came to understand the 60 scoop, the more and more I came to see it as cultural genocide of First Nations and Métis people in Canada.
Carolyn Bennett announced that they were settling and apologizing, and she said that they were just dealing with First Nations and Inuit.
Notre Livia, notre parenti, Pepe Matuin. Notre Livia, notre parenti, Pepe Matuin.
The more and more I came to understand the 60s scoop, the more and more I came to see it as cultural genocide of First Nations and Métis people in Canada. It was really never designed to care for Indigenous children.
Being a child of the, the 60s scoop, it's like I was ready to die of a broken heart. But that's really what it feels like. It's such a loss. It's like the loss of a limb that can never be replaced.
The thing is, you can't forget about this stuff. And you carry it with you every day because you've lost things. And as far as forgiving, who do I forgive?
Notre Livia, notre parenti, Pepe Matuin.
The whole idea of being with your biological family is a huge thing for anybody. Growing up with their values and their languages and their beliefs and the way they live. And when you take that away from somebody, they can, in most instances, they can't ever get that back. At least the memories they can. She said to me that, we've been looking for you for 20 years, Robert, and your mushroom would always say to us, go and find my little man. I want to see him before he dies. He died 2 years prior to me meeting him. So I never did get to meet my grandma and grandpa, my mushroom and cook 'em. And as you can see, kind of, it bothers me, eh? The first time I met him was in the archives. I do a lot of research in the archives, and I found a picture, and it says, Happy Métis Grandfather. And the caption said that, and here it says underneath it, Celestin Mackay, Buffalo and Arrows, and he's surrounded by all the rest of his grandkids, except one.
People wanted to know, even systems want to know, who is your next of kin? What is your family history in terms of health issues, right? So these were a lot of unanswered questions for me, and a lot of times I just had a lot of shame and a lot of pain in terms of trying to respond to those questions and not let on my experience of being only a foster child or a nobody's child. It wasn't until through the help of a lawyer and really being persistent and determined that when social services released me a few case summaries that I found out on black on white that I was of Métis ethnic origin, that my maternal grandparents were of Métis ethnic origin, and that my maternal mother and biological father were of Métis ethnic origin. So I finally had the proof in the pudding, if you will. And so that's what started that search, an inner search for me. There are really no supports or services to facilitate a reunion. We're left to our own devices after we have been systemically robbed of our life skills, of skills of relating, of skills that say this is where we come from, this is our identity. I had none of those skills. And really my biological mother, she was on a whole different level, you know, in her own journey.
For First Nations people, it was certainly didn't reflect their understanding of their children. And for Métis people, it was the same. It reflected badly on themselves as parents, on their communities. And so as a result of the AIM program, there was a very intensive resistance, especially by Métis leaders in our province and Indigenous women. In response to the AIM ads, it was Métis people that were the first to begin a letter writing campaign, organizing around it, meeting together, formulating plans for Métis foster homes, getting the Métis community to think about fostering kids. That was the ways in which they started to demand that their children come back to their communities, and they take back that role, in a sense, of caring for children and caring for families and rebuilding those families that had been broken up.
They've taken a lot of our people, they've taken a lot of lives, they've taken a lot of babies, they've taken a number of things. But for the ones that had that strength to move on, they now seen that they couldn't kill us. They couldn't take who we were as Métis and First Nation people. They couldn't wipe us out. I'm known as Senator Elder Nora Cummings, and I'm a Métis senator. This is my home. I'm a road allowance Métis. I lived in Saskatoon all my life when we lived on a road allowance here. We told them, you have to take these ads away, because they're all our children, all our little brown faces, and they're like little puppy dogs. Little so-and-so is well-trained, little so-and-so now is able to read, and all these kind of things. And I thought, how degrading this is. You do that to my children, let me tell you, it wouldn't work. So we did, we stopped that. We got that stopped. We got them stopped taking over the border.
Carolyn Bennett announced that they were settling and apologizing, and she said that they were just dealing with First Nations and Inuit. And I was shocked, man. And in a real state of disbelief, really in a state of disbelief, because how could this happen again?
The government isn't off the hook, because no, it's not just about financial compensation. How can you put a dollar value on the number of traumas and losses that have happened for many of us? Really, shame on a system that has taken away a child's most valuable resource, family, an extended family and community. And no dollar amount can replace that.
As far as I'm concerned, if they really want to work with us as people, they cannot work with our politicians. It should be within our communities. The communities are the ones that they should be working with, because those communities are the ones that are looking after our families. Our family members are in there. They know what is needed in those communities.
First Nations and Métis people still have to really argue that, strongly that it's their right to care for their children, that it's their responsibility to care for their children, and that they can do the best job for their children. It's really having to create a new narrative around who's the best to care for Indigenous children.
I look at it this way, that while we're here, let's make some very good choices. Let's help the next generation get to the place where they need to be so that they can ascend and ensure that what has happened to us doesn't continue.
To our lost children who are beginning and continuing their journey home, for those who have not yet found their voice, their stories, their belonging, their identity and relations, may our lost children find their own strength, courage, and voice within, so that they may never need to walk alone again. Mmiwg.
All right, guys, does anyone have any comments about anything we've seen tonight? We're not doing the breakout questions. I sent everybody an email about that. Carolina?
Oh, I think that the video you showed us is very powerful, but it also strikes me how they can exclude the Métis Nation from any of the legal settlements that will take place. It's just tragic for those people, because it appears to me that majority of the children taken were Métis, in fact.
A great deal were absolutely true. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. All right, guys. So thank you. I'll send you all the Google form for the participation. And again, next week and the week after are our last two lectures, both dealing with criminal justice. And then 3 weeks from tonight are the group presentations. Okay, guys, thanks very much, and see you next week.